Welcome to Truth Behind History, the channel where we dive deep into the moments that shaped our world. Today, we're diving into a subject that has sparked debates, revolutions, and even shaped entire nations, Marxism. But to truly understand Marxism, we have to go back to where it all began, the 19th century industrial world. This was an era of massive change. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society, transforming once rural economies into factory-driven powerhouses. Cities swelled with workers seeking jobs, but instead of finding prosperity, many found exploitation, poverty, and grueling conditions. It was in this environment that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels developed one of the most radical critiques of capitalism the world had ever seen. Their ideas weren't just pulled from thin air. They were a response to the very real struggles of workers in rapidly industrializing societies. So what exactly was happening in these factories and cities that led to such extreme ideas? How did Marx and Engels take these economic realities and turn them into a global movement? And most importantly, how did their ideas impact the world both in the 19th century and today? That's exactly what we're going to explore. So grab a seat, maybe a cup of tea, and let's step back into the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution completely transformed society. Cities exploded in size, factories sprang up everywhere, and new technologies reshaped how people lived and worked. But beneath this so-called progress were harsh realities that most workers faced every day. Let's start with urbanization. People flooded into industrial cities looking for work, but these cities weren't ready for the massive population boom. Housing, overcrowded, streets, filthy, water, contaminated. Many families were packed into tiny apartments with barely enough space to breathe. Disease spread quickly, and factory smoke hung heavy in the air. For many, moving to the city wasn't the promise of a better life. It was just trading one kind of struggle for another. Then there was labor exploitation. Imagine working 12, maybe even 16 hours a day in a factory. The air is thick with dust, machines roar around you, and there are no safety regulations to protect you if something goes wrong. Wages were barely enough to survive, and if you got hurt on the job, you were simply replaced. Even children were put to work, operating dangerous machinery for a fraction of an already low wage. And finally, social stratification, the widening gap between the rich and the poor. The wealthy business owners, known as the bourgeoisie, controlled the factories, the money, and the political power. Meanwhile, the workers, the proletariat, had little control over their lives. The system was stacked against them, and as time went on, resentment started to build. This was the world Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw firsthand, and it's exactly why they believed capitalism was a deeply flawed system, one that would eventually lead to revolution. But how did they turn these problems into an entire political philosophy? Let's take a look. Marx and Engels didn't invent their ideas out of thin air. They were influenced by thinkers before them, borrowing key concepts and shaping them into their own revolutionary worldview. Think of it as a philosophical potluck. Different intellectual traditions brought different dishes to the table, and Marx mixed them together to create something entirely new. First, Hegelian dialectics. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, yes, that's a mouthful, believed that history moves forward through conflict and resolution. One idea, the thesis, clashes with its opposite, the antithesis, and from that struggle emerges a new idea, the synthesis. This cycle of change is what Marx later used to explain the evolution of society, except Marx saw it as a struggle between economic classes rather than just abstract ideas. Next, political economy. Marx didn't reject capitalism outright. He studied it deeply. He borrowed from Adam Smith and David Ricardo, two economists who explored labor and value. Smith introduced the idea that labor creates wealth, and Ricardo argued that wages tend to stay low while profits go to the owners. Marx took this further, claiming that workers were being exploited. They produced far more value than they were paid for, while capitalists pocketed the difference. Finally, the French socialists. Before Marx, utopian socialists like Saint-Simon and Fourier had already proposed ideas about a more equal society, but Marx found their ideas too idealistic. He wanted a scientific approach to socialism based on material conditions and historical forces rather than just wishful thinking. By blending these influences, Marx and Engels crafted a radical new critique of capitalism, and soon they'd put it all together in one explosive document, the Communist Manifesto. But before we get to that, let's take a deeper look at what their theories actually said. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published what would become one of the most influential political documents in history, the Communist Manifesto. It opens with a dramatic line, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." That alone was enough to make the ruling class nervous. But Marx and Engels weren't just trying to scare people. They were laying out a radical new vision of history, society, and revolution. At the heart of the manifesto is class struggle. Marx argued that all of history is driven by the conflict between different social classes. In his time, the main battle was between the bourgeoisie, the wealthy factory owners and capitalists, and the proletariat, the working class who labored under harsh conditions for little pay. Marx believed this conflict wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of capitalism, it was an inevitable part of it. The bourgeoisie, in his view, thrived by exploiting workers. Capitalism prioritized profit over people, keeping wages low while the wealthy accumulated more and more power. But Marx saw this system as unstable. He believed that as conditions worsened, workers would eventually realize their collective strength. And when that happened, revolution was not just possible, it was inevitable. This is where the manifesto makes its most famous call to action. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Marx and Engels weren't just analyzing history, they were actively encouraging workers to rise up, dismantle capitalism, and establish a new society based on collective ownership and equality. The ideas in this manifesto would spread like wildfire. But how did they hold up in practice? And what happened when revolutions actually broke out later that year? That's what we'll look at next. In 1848, Europe erupted in revolution. From France to Germany, from Italy to Austria, uprisings swept across the continent as people demanded political and social change. Some wanted democratic reforms, others fought for national independence, and workers pushed back against economic hardship. For Marx, this was exactly the kind of class struggle he had written about in the Communist Manifesto. Marx didn't just sit back and watch. He got involved. He used his newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, to spread revolutionary ideas and rally support. He called for working-class uprisings, believing that the time had come for the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. But despite all the energy behind these revolts, they ultimately failed. Governments cracked down hard, crushing the movements and forcing many revolutionaries, including Marx, into exile. The failure of 1848 was a wake-up call. Marx realized that spontaneous uprisings weren't enough. If workers wanted to overthrow capitalism, they needed something bigger: global solidarity, better organization, and long-term political strategy. These lessons would shape the future of Marxism, leading to the formation of international socialist movements in the years to come. So what exactly did Marx take away from all this? And how did he refine his ideas after 1848? Let's take a look. Marx didn't just criticize capitalism. He built an entire framework to explain how and why it functioned the way it did. His theories weren't just political. They were meant to be a scientific analysis of history, economics, and society. Let's break down three of his core ideas. First, historical materialism. Marx argued that economic structures shape everything in society: politics, culture, even ideas. He believed that history moves through stages, each defined by a different class struggle: feudal lords and peasants, capitalists and workers. Change happens when one class overthrows another, and he saw capitalism as just another stage that would eventually be replaced. Next is surplus value. This is the core of Marx's economic critique. Workers create goods that have value, but they don't get paid the full amount of what those goods are worth. Instead, the capitalist takes the difference as profit. Marx saw this as exploitation, arguing that workers were being robbed of the true value of their labor. Finally, alienation. In earlier times, a craftsman might make a whole product from start to finish and take pride in their work. But in a factory, workers were reduced to tiny, repetitive tasks. They didn't own what they made, they didn't see the bigger picture, and they had no control over their work. Marx believed this alienated workers not just from their labor, but from each other and even from their own sense of purpose. These ideas formed the backbone of Marx's critique of capitalism. But what did people think of them at the time? And how did governments and rival thinkers respond? That's what we'll look at next. Marx's ideas were never universally accepted. From the moment he put pen to paper, his theories sparked fierce debate, government crackdowns, and divisions even within the socialist movement itself. Let's look at three of the biggest challenges Marxism faced. First, many saw it as too radical. Governments, business owners, and even some reformers worried that Marx's calls for revolution would destabilize society and lead to chaos. They saw the violent uprisings of 1848 as a warning sign of what could happen if workers actually followed Marx's ideas. To the ruling class, communism wasn't just a theory, it was a direct threat to their power. Beyond politics, Marx also faced serious philosophical disputes. His theory of historical materialism, which argued that economic forces drive history, didn't sit well with many thinkers. Some believed ideas, culture, and religion played just as big a role, if not a bigger one, in shaping society. Even among fellow socialists, not everyone agreed with Marx's belief that class struggle was the key to historical progress. Then there was suppression and division. Many governments actively censored Marxist writings, shut down socialist newspapers, and arrested activists. But Marx also faced opposition from within the socialist movement itself. Anarchists like Mikhail Bakunin rejected Marx's idea of a centralized worker-led state, arguing instead for a society without any governing authority. These divisions led to constant infighting among leftist groups, weakening their ability to organize. Despite these challenges, Marxism continued to spread, and as workers' movements gained momentum in the late 19th century, Marx's ideas found new life. But how did Marxism influence the world beyond his lifetime? That's what we'll explore next. Marxism didn't just fade away after Marx's death. His ideas spread far beyond 19th century Europe and became a driving force in global politics. Whether you agree with his theories or not, there's no denying that Marx left an enormous impact on the world. First, Marxist thought inspired workers' movements and socialist parties worldwide. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, labor unions and political organizations used Marx's ideas to demand better wages, working conditions, and rights for the working class. Many socialist and communist parties formed around his theories, shaping political discourse across continents. Then came the 20th century revolutions. From the Russian Revolution in 1917 to the rise of Communist China in 1949, Marxist ideology became the foundation for major political upheavals. It influenced movements in Cuba, Vietnam, and beyond, creating governments that claimed to follow Marxist principles, though often adapting them in ways that Marx himself might not have recognized. Even today, Marxism remains relevant in debates over inequality, labor rights, and economic systems. While full-scale communist revolutions are rare in the modern era, Marx's critique of capitalism still resonates. His ideas continue to fuel discussions on wealth distribution, corporate power, and the role of the state in regulating the economy. Marx may not have lived to see the full impact of his work, but his theories have shaped history in ways he could have only imagined. Now, as we wrap up, let's take a look at the key takeaways from everything we've covered. We've covered a lot in this deep dive into Marxism, so let's take a moment to sum it all up. Marxism was born out of the industrial upheavals of the 19th century. It emerged as a response to the harsh realities of capitalism, long working hours, low wages, and extreme inequality. Marx and Engels argued that class struggle was the driving force of history and that capitalism, like feudalism before it, would eventually collapse and be replaced by a new system. Its legacy is undeniable. Marxist ideas inspired revolutions, workers' movements, and political systems that reshaped entire nations. Even today, debates over inequality, labor rights, and economic justice continue to be influenced by Marx's critiques. But beyond history and politics, Marxism forces us to reflect critically on economic systems. It challenges us to question how wealth and power are distributed, how labor is valued, and whether we can create a fairer society. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about history's biggest ideas, be sure to subscribe to Truth Behind History. Like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and check out my other videos for more deep dives into the forces that have shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.